Well, Misty and I are real big fans of the movie Secondhand Lions. And some of you may have seen it, but if you haven't, it tells the story of a boy named Walter. Now, Walter doesn't have the best mother, and so one summer she sends Walter to live with his two uncles, who live in the middle of nowhere on a rundown farm. It's an old building. There's nobody that lives near them. They don't even have phone or a television. So Walter's not really that happy about it. But as the summer goes on, he starts to get to know his two uncles, Hub and Garth, a little bit better. And his uncle Garth starts telling these amazing stories. He says that when they were younger, Hub and Garth went to Europe, and they arrived in France the day the Germans invaded on World War I. Eventually, Hub and Garth are forced into the French Foreign Legions, and they're fighting enemies in North Africa. And then they get out of the Foreign Legion, and Hub becomes a soldier of fortune. He starts working as a freedom fighter in different areas, and falls in love with a beautiful woman named Jasmine. Unfortunately, Jasmine is engaged and betrothed to an evil, vicious sheik. And through a series of adventures and battles, Hub and Garth are able to win Jasmine, they win a small fortune, and they win the respect and the admiration of the sheik. Now, Walter grows to love his uncles, and he really loves these stories, but he doesn't really believe them. I mean, his uncles have some money, they seem like great guys, but he thinks this is just two older men trying to impress a younger person. If you fast forward to the end of the movie, 20 or so years later, Hub and Garth have died, Walter's now a full-grown man, and he goes back to the old farm to pay his respects and to hear the reading of the will. While he's there, though, a helicopter lands on the center of the property, comes down from the sky, and it's got the trademark of a North African oil company. And a young Arabic man gets out and asks, "Was this the home of Hub and Garth McCann?" And Walter's shocked. He's like, "Well, yes, this was, but how did you know my uncles?" And he says, "Well, I didn't know them, but my grandfather used to tell me stories of these two crazy Americans, the only two people that ever outsmarted him, and he really respected them." And it's at that moment Walter realizes, wow, they were telling the truth. They really were in the Foreign Legion. They realized all those amazing stories were true, and it really changed the way that Walter looked at his uncles. Now, the Bible has some amazing stories, and as human beings, sometimes we might not believe them right away. We might think, well, they tell us good things, but they can't be real. And I think probably the most incredible story has to be the gospel. The idea that God came to earth, died for us, for our sins, and rose again. That's an unbelievable story. And Paul gets into that in 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through 11. And as we look at what Paul says, as we look at his words on 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through 11, I want us to think, how can we respond to what Paul says? Because the gospel is the core of Christianity. The gospel is the foundation of our faith. The gospel is the reason that we are here today. And guys, the gospel is true. And I want us to make sure we understand that. I hope that when we're done, we know the truth, we know the whole truth, and we know the power of the truth. Now, the first way I think we should respond to Paul is that we need to be centered on the gospel. Paul, when he's talking about the gospel to them, he tells them early on, he states his purpose. He says, "I want to clarify for you the gospel that you received from my teaching." Now, if you've read 1 Corinthians, a lot of the letter is corrective. The Corinthian people had a lot of things wrong. They were doing the wrong things. They had questions about other things. They weren't a church that was a model church. And Paul's already spent 14 chapters talking about all these issues they have. But before the letter ends, he wants to make sure that they understand the gospel. He wants to make sure they have this one concept down, and down well. And I think we need to ask ourselves, why is it that Paul felt the gospel was so important? Why could Paul not end that letter until he knew the Corinthians had that down? Well, Paul tells us. He tells us the gospel is foundational for Christianity. As Misty read earlier, he described the gospel as the most important thing. The Greek word that he uses there is protois. And protois can be defined as first, as foremost, as chief, as the beginning, or as the best. And I think all of those are in play here. The gospel was the best thing, the most important thing that Paul taught. But the gospel is also the first thing. The gospel is the foundation for Christianity. My mom and dad built a house this past year, and they started building in December, which I thought was a little weird, because I don't like being outside in the cold, and that's when they decided to start framing and things. My dad's pretty handy. He had a friend who's a contractor, and they were excited about framing the house and getting the roof on, and they wanted to get that done before February, because the really cold weather comes in February. But they had to wait a couple weeks longer than they wanted, because the foundation hadn't been laid yet. And I've never built my own house, but I know that before you do, you've got to dig the foundation, you got to lay the concrete, and you have to let that set and cure. You cannot drive a single nail until the foundation is built. And in the same way, the Corinthians were messing up in a lot of areas. They had a lot of issues and a lot of things they weren't doing correctly. And I think Paul realized it's because their foundation wasn't right. Now, my wife and I recently built a playset. I think I mentioned that in the last sermon. And the area we built it on wasn't quite level. There's a little dip in the middle. And because the foundation for that playset isn't quite right, the other levels on the playset have some tilts, have some dips, have some places where they're not level. And I think Paul sensed that in the Corinthian church. Their foundation, their understanding of the gospel wasn't correct, and they needed some foundation repair. They needed to understand what the foundation for Christianity was before they could have these other teachings make sense. So we have to be centered on the gospel, because the gospel is our foundation. The gospel is where it starts. The gospel comes first, and the gospel is the truth. But Paul didn't end there. He did call the gospel most important, but then thankfully he went on to explain the gospel. He was telling the Corinthians, I don't think you have this right. I want to make sure you understand it. And Paul tells us the gospel has three key elements. There are three non-negotiable parts to the gospel. And he especially, as we'll see, focuses on the last one. He focuses on that third part. First, he tells us that Jesus Christ died for our sins. Now, the word gospel comes from the Greek word evangelion, which literally means the good news. So the gospel for us is our good news. And at first, Christ dying might not sound like good news. That sounds like terrible news. But we have to remember two things. Christ's death was not an accident. The Old Testament scriptures, Isaiah, the Psalms, Zechariah, all of those scriptures declared that the Messiah would come and would suffer and would die. Christ himself said he was going to suffer, he was going to be rejected, and he was going to die. So the gospel's good news because Christ's death wasn't an accident.